Okay, welcome to our first flipped classroom online lecture for biology. I'll just remind you that as you're going through this lecture, it will stop periodically and ask questions. Remember that I will be checking these, not just that you have begun, but also that you've completed the entire assignment and that you've answered all the questions. If you have if you're not really sure about the answers to the questions, you can always go back. You can rewind the video to check on those. All right, so let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about energy and life. We'll be getting into photosynthesis in this chapter. And then in the next chapter, talking about the same process as how we make energy in animal cells. But right now, we're just going to be mainly talking about plants. Okay, so last chapter we talked about homeostasis, the whole idea that cells and organisms work really hard to keep a general level. They work really hard to stay at the same level all the time. Okay, so homeostasis is hard work, and organisms and the cells within them have to grow and develop, move materials around, build new molecules, and respond to the environmental changes. We also remind you should be taking notes on this. So remember all those times in class when you didn't have enough time to write everything down? Well, now you do. You can just pause this and write down as much as you need to. All right, make sure you do that. What powers so much activity, and where does the power come from? So, let's see. Why is ATP useful to cells? ATP, which is the energy we're going to be talking about, can easily release and store energy by breaking and reforming the bonds between its phosphate groups. This characteristic of ATP makes it exceptionally useful as a basic energy source for cells. So what does that mean? That means that ATP is our energy source, and the energy is released when one of the phosphate groups breaks off. So ATP, adenosine tri, meaning 3 phosphate. One of those phosphate groups breaks off, gives you ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So this is our source of energy. Okay. Energy is the ability to do work. Okay, you should know that definition. And your cells are using energy to build new molecules, contract muscles, all those things that we've talked about. Without the ability to obtain and use energy, there would not be life. So this is kind of the rate limiting factor in everything. If there is no energy, then nothing else can happen. All right, so adenosine triphosphate, ATP. As you can see here, it has the adenine ring, where we talked about this when we were discussing nucleotide bases, the ribosome, the 5-sided sugar, and then it has 3 phosphate groups. Okay, this is the structure of ATP. Become familiar with it. Adenosine diphosphate looks almost like ATP, except that, you guessed it, it only has 2 phosphate groups instead of 3. Okay, ADP contains some energy, and we'll talk later about what we can do with that. It just doesn't have as much energy as ATP. When a cell has energy available, it can store small amounts of it by adding phosphate groups to the ADP to produce energy. So what does that mean? Basically, think of it like a rechargeable battery. ADP is like the rechargeable battery that powers the machinery of a cell. Cells can release the energy stored in ATP by breaking the bonds between the second and the third phosphate groups. Because a cell can add or subtract these phosphate groups, it has an efficient way of storing and then releasing energy. Okay, so when the third phosphate is added to ADP, that becomes storage. When the third phosphate is broken off of ATP, that releases the energy. Okay. One way that cells use energy provided by ATP is to carry out active transport. Many cell membranes contain sodium potassium pumps. ATP provides the energy that keeps these pumps working, maintaining a balance of ions on both sides of the cell. So, sodium potassium pumps are used within the cell, but they need energy to keep the sodium and potassium in the right places. So would this be active transport or passive transport? All right, using biochemical energy. ATP powers movements, providing the energy for motor proteins that contract muscles and power the movement, for example, of cilia on flagella. So the whole way that the cilia and the flagella move, not the cilia on flagella, sorry, the cilia and flagella, the whole way that all this moves is through ATP energy. Energy from ATP powers the synthesis of proteins and responses to chemical signals at the cell surface. So, the signals that we talked about last time, the junctions between the cells, what cells that send signals, the fact that cells have to have receptors, these signals can are processed, through this ATP energy. So ATP energy from ATP powers the synthesis of the proteins and responses in the chemical signals that we just finished talking about in the last chapter. Okay, this next graphic we'll be going into much more in the future. I just want you to be somewhat aware of it. In the next chapter, you will get to learn much more about it than what's just shown on this graphic. So ATP is not a good molecule for storing large amounts of energy over a long term. It's just short-term storage. It is more efficient for cells to keep only a small supply of ATP on hand. Cells can generate ATP from ADP as needed by using the energy in foods like glucose. Okay, so this is just a brief overview. There are three parts to making energy. Begin with glycolysis, which literally means breaking glucose. So glucose is broken down. That then goes into the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, and finally an electron transport chain. Okay, but as I said, you'll get to know all of that a lot more in the next chapter. Next, we're going to talk about heterotrophs and autotrophs. What happens during the process of photosynthesis? Okay, so let's just talk about in the process of photosynthesis, plants convert the energy of sunlight into chemical energy stored in the bonds of carbohydrates, right? You know that already. What are heterotrophs and autotrophs? So, organisms that obtain food by consuming other living things are heterotrophs. Hetero meaning other, trophs meaning feeding or food. So, heterotrophs get their food from something else. They don't make it. Some heterotrophs get their food by eating plants, by eating whatever. But the thing is that they're not making their own food. Unlike autotrophs, autotrophs make their own food, meaning which is the whole word auto. They're on their own. Trophs, food, or feeding. So plants, algae, and some bacteria are able to use light energy from the sun to produce food. The process by which autotrophs use the energy of the sunlight to produce high energy carbohydrates that can be used for food is known as photosynthesis. Okay, in the next section, we will be going into much more depth the process of photosynthesis and when light's there and when light's not there. So make sure that you've read your chapter and that you are ready for class tomorrow.